Dear Professor Black, dear Jeremy, we are very proud to have you here and very reconnaissant for having accepted our invitation. Dirò alcune parole in italiano rivolte al pubblico, non per presentare uno dei nostri maggiori storici, ma per sottolineare l'importanza specifica di questo suo intervento. Come voi sapete, il professor Black ha una produzione storica veramente sterminata, più di 200 volumi e una infinita quantità di articoli, recensioni, visiting professorship, praticamente in tutte le università maggiori e in tutte le istituzioni accademiche maggiori del mondo, non soltanto del mondo occidentale. E anche in Italia è stato molte volte ospite della nostra accademia. E questa però è la prima volta che è ospite della Società Italiana di Storia Militare per presentare una relazione sulla geopolitica del Mediterraneo vista in una prospettiva britannica. Non la prospettiva britannica, ma una prospettiva britannica che egli ha selezionato, ha scelto all'interno della sua vastissima conoscenza della storia militare inglese e della storia militare globale. E questa è una delle caratteristiche, credo, fondamentali dell'insegnamento del professor Black, e cioè la visione globale e di lunga durata della storia militare, in cui le dimensioni geopolitiche, geostrategiche, geoeconomiche e anche sociali, culturali della storia della guerra e in generale della storia, diciamo, della sicurezza, dei conflitti e della stessa società sono perfettamente messe in sinergia, ma non generalizzando e basta, ma partendo sempre da una approfondita conoscenza degli eventi e delle particolarità da cui il professore ci ha insegnato a trarre, estrarre e selezionare gli aspetti realmente rilevanti. Questo credo che si può dire in estrema sintesi è l'insegnamento che noi abbiamo recepito da lui in 5 anni di collaborazione molto intensa, sia come membro del nostro consiglio scientifico di nuova antologia militare e sia come autore anche di articoli e recensioni, ma anche e soprattutto come editor di una serie di volumi all'interno della nostra collana series Fucina di Marte, che affianca NAM, Nuova Antologia Militare. Noi abbiamo una rivista scientifica, Scientific Journal, e una collana, e in questo momento abbiamo pubblicato 20 fascicoli, 20 issues della rivista e 18 volumi della collana. Ma proprio in occasione di questo nostro incontro abbiamo già messo in cantiere il 5° e il 6° volume. Il 4° volume è già in fiere, diciamo. Come voi vedete qui dai volumi che abbiamo esposto, i primi 3 riguardano il primo è stato questo qui, cioè quello che riguarda le trasformazioni militari dal 1450 al 1800, e il concetto di transformation è intenzionalmente diretto a mettere tra guillemets, virgolette, revolution, military revolution. È una forma di critica di questo concetto. Gli altri due riguardano la prassi strategica, the strategy in practice, the practice of strategy in a global history. Questo è un concetto, quello della strategy in practice, che consente di vedere gli aspetti strategici anche nelle esperienze che non conoscono questo concetto usato nel senso militare del termine. Ed è, credo, una delle acquisizioni che gli strategisti, diciamo, i cultori di studi strategici hanno recepito dall'utilizzo che nelle scienze aziendali e sociologiche è stato fatto del concetto di strategia, a volte anche in una forma che a noi storici militari non sempre convince. E il terzo volume è quello sulla cavalry warfare, cioè è il modo di combattere della cavalleria nel corso della storia, e tra l'altro ancora attuale, visto che una esperienza di combattimento, di impiego militare dei cavalli c'è stato ancora durante la guerra di Afghanistan, e c'è addirittura un monumento a New York in cui si vede un agente della CIA a cavallo che si inerpica con il suo M1 su una montagna scoscesa, perché era l'unico modo di arrivare a compiere il suo lavoro. E il prossimo volume, che è in cantiere, che uscirà, se tutto va bene, in gennaio prossimo, è Geopolitics and War. Il titolo è interessantissimo ed è la cosa più interessante che, diciamo, mi fa anche molto piacere come italiano, è che ci sono 4 contributori italiani, quindi un numero crescente rispetto al numero che in tutti questi volumi ci sono stati anche contributori italiani, perché una delle cose fondamentali a cui teniamo con la rivista e con la collana è una stretta integrazione. Questi sono lavori che noi pubblichiamo in inglese proprio per facilitare la circolazione e la conoscenza, ma al tempo stesso vogliamo anche promuovere il contributo specificamente italiano a questa disciplina. Contributo italiano che, a mio avviso, ha una sua specificità, e cioè una attenzione molto forte agli aspetti filologici, e quindi all'importanza dello studio delle parole, applicando un po' quella che è la lezione, diciamo, appresa dallo studio della storia antica. E qui ho il piacere di avere accanto a noi il professor Brizzi, Giovanni Brizzi, dell'Università di Bologna, il quale è stato l'antesignano di questa strategia, perché ha nel 2012 varato la prima rivista militare italiana, la rivista di studi militari, che aveva una pubblicazione all'anno, ma che riuniva già a livello internazionale i maggiori storici militari con cui eravamo in contatto in quel periodo, e con prevalenza, comprensibilmente, degli storici militari del mondo antico, no? Jan Le Boec, ma c'era tra l'altro un grande storico che è stato anche un po' un tramite tra noi e il professor Jeremy Black, cioè Hugh Strachan. Sì. E in tutta questa vicenda, questa rivista non ha potuto continuare diciamo, perché aveva un editore che era la Patron di Bologna, che non riteneva ancora opportuno la pubblicazione online. E quando questa rivista è cessata, noi abbiamo, come Società Italiana di Storia Militare, insieme al professor Brizzi, che è vicepresidente della Società Italiana di Storia Militare, abbiamo deciso di continuare questa esperienza con una rivista che è essenzialmente online e che non è finanziata da un ente pubblico come un'università o come il Ministero della Difesa, ma è finanziata dai soci membri della nostra associazione, che attualmente conta circa 500 membri. Tra questi ne abbiamo una cinquantina che partecipano alla scuola di autoformazione dei giovani studiosi. Qui ne abbiamo presenti due, in particolare poi abbiamo presente Luca Domizio, che è uno degli autori italiani di questo ultimo, last but not least, volume sulla storia della cavalleria, e che è anche il vicepresidente del comitato specifico della SISM, che sta organizzando la terza scuola che si terrà a Faenza, dove avremo anche i nostri amici di supporto, di sostegno, diciamo, a questa iniziativa, e poi tutte le altre, diciamo, che sono ragazzi che stanno affrontando adesso il dottorato di ricerca a livello internazionale, quindi sono molto impegnati, non stanno soltanto in Italia, sono molto impegnati nella loro formazione, nella loro esperienza. In particolare oggi abbiamo avuto il piacere di ascoltare quella di Carlo Alberto Rebottini, il quale ci ha parlato dei suoi viaggi prossimi negli Stati Uniti e in Inghilterra, all'Università di Oxford. Luca è reduce da un soggiorno a Parigi e poi adesso sta facendo il dottorato presso una delle istituzioni nostre, diciamo, legate alla SISM, delle poche ancora che ci sono attive nell'università, che è il laboratorio di storia navale, che penso sarà anche coinvolto nel prossimo volume. Allora, please, Professor Black.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, what I want to do is not to read to you what I have already written here, because I know that Virgilio has sent it to you, and if you want to read it, it's there. And if any of you haven't yet got it, please do not hesitate to ask him for a copy. What I want to do is to talk around the topic, to discuss its present relevance, and to then use the opportunity of having here a group of friends and colleagues to discuss the nature of military history today. I would like, though, to start with several minutes of courtesy, which is deeply felt courtesy, because I have a great affection for Italy. I first came to Italy in the beginning of the 1960s with my parents, not too far from here, in fact, to Cattolica, all right? And I came again on my first holiday with my father as an older schoolboy before going to university, in fact, to Rome. So I have a lot of affection for Italy. I have written for English readers a history of Italy. I don't know whether it's been translated into Italian. You would not need to read it, but I have a lot of affection. Secondly, I want to, on behalf of all of us, pay tribute to Virgilio, to what he has done, to the importance of the society, and to testify to the significance of the society, not just in Italy, important as that is, but also more generally. And in doing so, I want to also say that Italian scholars, and we have here Professor Brizzi's book on the Roman period, Italian scholars make an enormous contribution on the international scale. Unfortunately, because so many non-Italians do not know Italian as a language, it tends to be underplayed, which is a great tragedy. But in intellectual terms, Italy is still at the forefront of European intellectual life, and I would like to pay tribute to two major scholars from that perspective. Now, let us start off. Well, go. You haven't heard. Wait till the fat man sits down before, as they said in the Marx Brothers. Now, let me start off a bit with this, and then we're going to broaden out more generally into geopolitics and military history. The point I was trying to make here, and the topic was chosen for me by Luigi, it was an excellent topic, but the point I was trying to make is that there is no one way to look at geopolitics. That one of the problems with the discussion of geopolitics is that there is apt to be a determinism, a geographical determinism, because there are geographical facts. The River Po flows into the Adriatic, the Alps are north of the Apennines, there is more food is produced in this part of Italy than is produced in Calabria and Apulia. There are geographical facts. But one of the problems is that people often read from those facts as if there was clear consequences, inevitable consequences in policy terms. And what I was trying to say is that geopolitics is a matter of perception and policy, rather like strategy. And like strategy, there is nothing inevitable about the strategic choices that you make. Now, it is true that when people who are contemporaries discuss strategy, we see this in the moment over Taiwan or Ukraine or Gaza or anything, when they discuss strategy, they will say, this is inevitable, this is necessary. Yes. But what they will not do is adequately accept the fact that there are differing ways of looking at a geopolitical environment, both at the perception of what is happening and at the perception of the possible responses. So the point about this paper, and I hope that this paper with footnotes and all the rest of it, and I'm still working on it, and I'm happy if people want to write to me with suggestions, I will happily incorporate them, or not. But what I wanted to look at was the British perception of the Mediterranean, not to say the British were right, that is a stupid approach, nor to say there was only one British approach, but to look at the point about the standard British approach, the British governmental approach, in order to show that you can have different responses to the geopolitics of the Mediterranean. Just as there would have been different responses if we were looking at Aragonese strategy and geopolitical thought about the Western Mediterranean in, shall we say, 1350, 1400, as opposed to Angevin, or as opposed to Florentine, or as opposed to Genoese. So let us take the British, not that the British is more important, just simply because I know about it, all right? Right. The point I was making in this paper is that the British were primarily navalists. You would assume that that would be the case because Britain did not have any significant land possessions in the Mediterranean. Its first was Gibraltar in 1704, but even, it eventually ends up at various times with, Gibraltar and Malta and Cyprus and the Ionian Islands. But the point is, they were never central to the way in which the British state, it didn't see itself as a Mediterranean power. As such, you have with the British the standard problem in geopolitics, that geopolitics is often an outsider's view. And an outsider will not necessarily understand what is going on, but will try and impose their understanding on the situation. If you want to think of a modern example, and again, I'm not praising or criticizing, I'm just simply observing, think about the American policy at the present moment, or policies in the Mediterranean. Those are the policies, like the British in the past, of an outsider in which they are trying to envisage the Mediterranean in their terms,
So their terms may be to try and restrict Russian power, to try and limit radical Islam, to try and, in their terms, strengthen the southern flank of NATO, whatever that means. That's just an image. You know, they will use language like that because they are trying to think very quickly through, whereas obviously people who live there will have a more complex sense of the relationships. So, in this piece, I looked at how the British response to the Mediterranean strategically developed in large part not because of the importance of the Mediterranean in itself, but as a way to limit French power. France was seen as the principal rival to the British, and the French power became something that the British tried to, as it were, counterbalance. They had the idea of the balance of power. The balance of power, remember, is an image. Whether you're thinking of the balance as in something in the Roman constitution, whether you're thinking of the balance as in Montesquieu, wherever you're thinking of a balance is an image. It doesn't describe a reality. There is no, you cannot firmly measure power. You cannot firmly measure strength or stability. So the British had this idea that they would counterbalance France by two means. One, naval strength, and two, an alliance structure in Europe. And that alliance structure in Europe in the late 17th, 18th century tended to focus on the British, the Dutch, and the Austrians, and usually involved Italy as part of the way to limit France. They knew nothing about the details of Italy. Most British people could not have found, there were maps, they couldn't have found any place in Italy other than Roma on a map. They wouldn't have known anything about the Este or the Gonzaga or, the problems of the Mantuan succession coming to an end, I think it's 1708, or they just would not have known about it. For them, Italy was important as a counter to French power. And the Mediterranean was important as a way to stop French expansion. France had two main ports, naval ports, maritime ports for the navy, Brest for the Atlantic fleet and Toulon for the Mediterranean fleet. And in British strategy, the Western Mediterranean is the way in which you contain Toulon, you contain the expansion of French power, you contain the way that the French might use their extension of power in order to destabilize alliance blocs against them. All right? That's how the Mediterranean starts off. I'm not talking about, obviously the English were in the Crusades, but I'm talking about in modern historical terms. The Mediterranean then changes, as I discuss in here, because the competition with France changes from a competition over Italy and the Western Mediterranean and becomes a competition over the Eastern question, the route to India. In particular, when Napoleon goes to Egypt in 1798, the English, the British, are worried about Napoleon in Egypt because they see this, as the French saw it, as a route strategically for the French to link up with opponents of Britain in India, particularly Tipu Sultan of Mysore. The British had a lot of problems in India with the French supporting opponents of the British from the 1740s, and that went on into the 1800s. So for the British, the Eastern Mediterranean becomes more important in the late 18th century, not because of anything to do with the Eastern Mediterranean, but because it is seen as the route to India. And the first British land force goes into Egypt in 1801. A second land force goes in 1807. The British take over Malta. They become, and at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, they take over the Ionian Islands, particularly Corfu, which is why people in Corfu still play cricket. Silly people. But so the British develop a territorial and military interest in the Eastern Mediterranean for that reason. And that interest in the Eastern Mediterranean goes on right through the 19th century, right in to the end of the British Empire, which is really the 1960s. Okay? So, if you just very quickly, I don't want to give you a history of the British Empire because that's, but very quickly in Mediterranean terms, that is why the British go into Cyprus in the 1870s. It's why they take over Cyprus. It's why they take over Egypt in the 1880s. It is why they move into Palestine, or whatever you want to call it, Israel, in the First World War and become the mandate power there. They become a major territorial power in the Eastern Mediterranean. They take over the French interests in the Suez Canal, and the Mediterranean for the British becomes the route from Gibraltar via Malta to Alexandria, the major naval base in the Eastern Mediterranean, and then down into the Suez Canal, through to Aden, where the British develop a base from 1839, which is, for the British, Aden is a forward station for the Mediterranean, for that route. So they develop the base even before the Suez Canal is open, because already there's trade through the Isthmus of Suez, and then on to India. All right? And that goes on. It's why the British spend a lot of time fighting the Italians in World War II in the Western Desert, not because the British care two hoots, really, but about who rules some sand dunes or who rules Cyrenaica. What they care about is to protect the Suez Canal. They are seeing themselves as protecting the forward defences to the route to India. It's why after the war, after World War II, they try and hold on to their mandate in Palestine. That goes wrong. But even after the mandate in Palestine is lost, the British keep a garrison in the Suez Canal zone till 1954, and then, having pulled it out in 54 because the Egyptian nationalists wanted out, they then try and retake the Suez Canal in 1956. It's why the British in 1958 send troops into Jordan, and why they keep a garrison in Aden until 1967. So all of that is Mediterranean policy. You may not see it like that as an Italian, but for the British, this is all part and parcel of the route through the Mediterranean. And the route through the Mediterranean is most vulnerable by that stage in the Middle East. It's not vulnerable in the Western Mediterranean because all of the powers in the Western Mediterranean in the late 40s and 50s are pro-Western. The French are still in control of Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia. Libya is under a pro-British, pro-Italian government until the king is overthrown. King Idris is overthrown. Italy and France are in NATO, and the attempts to establish, Russian attempts to establish, Soviet attempts to establish more neutralist governments fail. Spain, under the fascists, is allied to the West. So there is no real worry about most of the Mediterranean. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece and Turkey are members of NATO, and Cyprus is a British colony till the end of the 50s, and Yugoslavia has broken with the Soviets, and who cares what the Albanians are doing? They're all regarded as crazy, and anyway, they break with the Soviets as well. So the position in the Mediterranean itself seems relatively secure. Now that situation, and we're coming up towards the modern day, that situation deteriorates markedly for the West from the late 1960s. Egypt goes more radical. The Americans had thought they could make a deal with Nasser. That fails. The French lose control of Algeria, and Algeria starts to look in a more radical direction. Gaddafi replaces Idris in Libya and takes Libya in a more eccentric direction. Soviet influence increases in Syria. We think that's now, actually that was already a big issue in the late 60s. But by that period, Britain was in decline. Britain was in decline. Its balance of payments, its finances collapse in 1967, 1968. They abandon the East of Suez policy. They feel they can't afford it anymore. And in essence, what happens is that in both the Mediterranean and in the Persian Gulf, security, naval security, is actually taken over by the Americans. So Napoli becomes a great American naval base. It is the Americans that take over most of the situation. America becomes the patron power of Israel. America becomes the chief power, worried about Libya, worried about Algeria, trying to keep the peace between Greece and Turkey. And thereafter, I think it's fair to say that Britain just bumps along. Right, the British would like to tell you they're still important. But I think it's fair to say that in the Mediterranean, the only really strategic thing they have is the listening stations in Cyprus. The listening stations in Cyprus are NATO's main intelligence asset in the Eastern Mediterranean. Most of that intelligence feed goes straight to the Americans, and that is the major role. Obviously, the British Navy is tiny now, like the Italian Navy is fairly small, and it's actually, if you want to see naval confrontation in the Mediterranean, it's between America and Russia. Now, all of that I discuss in greater details. I want now to talk a bit more about strategy. Anybody got any questions on this before we move on? No. No, later. All right, later. What I have tried in this case to show is what I would more generally say as true in terms of strategy. That you cannot divorce, just as you cannot take military history out of history as a whole, and that is the importance of the work of our two colleagues, so you cannot take the rest of history out of military history. They are as one. And crucially, what war is about and what the military system's about is about choice, not determinism. Geopolitics, as an example of that, is about choice. It is what threats you prioritize and how you determine within that situation what response. Now, some people try and short circuit. By the way, am I speaking too fast? Is what? No, you're okay. No. Some people try and short circuit this by saying there's no problem, it's just keeping up with technology. All right? They argue that whatever is the latest platform or the latest weapon system provides you with the answer. So in other words, the answer today would be adopt the drone, that's it. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. And the question is how you respond to the particular challenges you have. Now, if you're the greatest power in the system, and the greatest power is the United States at the moment, you actually have this very dramatized because there are questions about how far you allocate resources to confrontation with China or confrontation with Iran or confrontation with Russia, and in each case, what you choose to do. It's easy to talk about confrontation with, say, Iran. Does confrontation with Iran mean providing missile defenses to Saudi Arabia? Does it mean encouraging Israel or cooperating with Israel against some strike against Iran? Does it mean just keeping a significant naval force in the Arabian Sea, west between Saudi Arabia and India? In other words, even if you decide there is a clear strategic problem, there is no clear strategic response. And in making a response, you actually end up delivering what I call a tasking. You give the military a tasking. In other words, a tasking is, this is what we want you to do. Now, who gives that tasking varies by political and military system. There may be a formal process, there may be an informal process. It may be explicitly decided, it may be implicitly decided, it may be that the military make the choices, it may be that the military don't make the choices. So in some countries, for example, the military are totally under the government. North Korea is a good example. If the North Korean dictator doesn't like you, you will get shot. Doesn't matter how senior you are. And the key issue is the role of the ruling dynasty, his control as a dynasty. In other areas, in theory, the state and the military are very closely integrated. In the case of the United States, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. In China, President Xi is not just the party leader and the head of the country, he's also head of the military committee. All right? So in theory, they are closely aligned. Doesn't actually mean that there isn't politics within the military, and politics within the military is one of the most understudied subjects by military historians. There are one or two stumps, and obviously in the case of scholars of ancient Rome, marvellous work on people like Marius and Sulla and Caesar, but that quality of work that we see in the ancient world has not been matched in most of military history. I think that's a very, so clearly generals in some respects are politicians in uniform. They are a different type of politician. And what are they politicians about? Well, patronage is a key thing, building up your groups, linking, as with, say, Sulla, with individual political strategies within the country domestically, whatever you mean by domestically, but also in terms of your foreign view, where you want to go. Do you want to go where Pompey wants to go? Do you want to go where Crassus wants to go? Do you want to go where Caesar wants to go? It is not inevitable if you are sitting in Rome in 55 BC as to what is Rome's principal strategic challenge, right? It is not inevitable if you are in France in 1797 as to, or 1798 as to what is France's key military challenge. Do you want to be a Mediterranean power and move via Taranto to Egypt, as Napoleon does? Do you want that geopolitics? Well, some did, but other generals preferred the idea of France being north of the Alps, and some of them said, no, we really should smash the British in their home waters. There is no, and other people were quite happy to say, let us wind down a bit. We don't want always to be at war. Because a big division in any political society, which influences what I call the culture of geopolitics, is do you want to fight continually? Now, in both civil society and military society, insofar as they are different, there is both the tendency to fight continually and there is the belief that you don't want to fight continually. Okay? For a whole host of reasons. Many generals are well aware that, as I put it, if two powers go to war, generally, not always, both sides think they can win, and inevitably at least one is wrong, and often both are wrong. All right? So in other words, war, the use of force, is often a wasting asset, and the people that know that best are military leaders. The people that know that least well are civilian leaders. So look at the idiots. I mean, I'm sorry to upset anybody, but look at the idiots who took the United States and Britain into war in Iraq in 2003. Those were overwhelmingly civilian leaders who believed they could produce a military solution to a problem that actually was far more fundamental than occupying pieces of territory. Okay? I'm not a pacifist. I'm just simply saying be careful when you go to war, because it's very difficult to foreclose and to determine the end result. Anyway, let us wind back. So what I am arguing is that if you are looking at the development of military systems, you have to look at the cultural and political contexts within which people make choices. Now, if you're looking at those political and cultural contexts in which people make choices, a key fact is this, that you can, as a society, use an identical military system, technology, or technique of force to another society, but do so in a way in which you are prepared to take more or less casualties, and your willingness to take more or less casualties is fundamental. So let me give you an example. And I'll give you an example from Britain. Again, not that Britain is more important, it's just I know about it. In 1945, obviously, near here, the British were fighting World War II and taking, quite heavy casualties. 1950 to 53, the British sent the second largest expeditionary force after the Americans to the Korean War. Most British people would never have been able to find Korea on a map of the world. There'd never been a British imperial presence in Korea. There was no British commercial links with Korea. It was of no importance, but they were doing it for, if you like, geopolitical reasons, reasons of containment. They were, if you like, fighting World War III in Europe on the Korean Peninsula, whatever you want to say. And again, they took heavy casualties, as indeed did the Americans. The Korean War, like the war in Ukraine at the present moment, became a trench warfare with heavy artillery usage, all right? And very little movement of the front line after, in the last 2 years. 1982, so that is less than 30 years later, and whilst Britain was still led by people that had been through World War II, and some of whom were decorated war heroes, the British fought the Falklands War. Now, you can take your view on whether they were right or wrong, and I don't particularly care. I'm not making that point. You can call it the Malvinas War if you like. I don't care. But the point I'm trying to make is this. The War Cabinet, who were composed of people who were quite determined. Mrs. Thatcher was a very determined person. Her deputy prime minister, Viscount Whitelaw, had won the Military Cross as a hero of tank warfare against the Germans in Normandy. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, had won the Military Cross fighting against the Germans as well. These were brave men, but they thought that domestic public opinion would only accept 1,000 fatalities, and that after that it would be necessary to negotiate with the Argentinians via American intermediaries. Now, we weren't short of people. Everybody in the armed forces were volunteers. There was no conscription. You might have thought, what on earth was this about? Clearly, we could have taken more than 1,000 fatalities. But their view was that domestic public opinion had changed its response. Now, go forward to today. We can see in Ukraine a democratic society. You can discuss the rights or wrongs, that's not my point. You can see a democratic society being willing to take heavy casualties, the same with the Israelis in Gaza. Again, I'm not talking about the rights or wrongs, I'm just talking about the fact. And then, if you wind back to the most bloody war in terms of military casualties, not civilian casualties, the most bloody war in terms of, actually, let me ask you a question. I believe in asking questions. And if you get it wrong, we will reenact the scene from the novel and then film Thunderball. I shall press a button here and your chair will be electrocuted, all right? So concentrate. 3,000 volts in the novel Thunderball, okay? And it won't be like going to the toilet in Japan, all right? So, what is the war since 1945 in which, these are three questions that are going to come. The war since 1945 in which there was most military casualties. Anybody? Okay, Chinese Civil War, 1946 to 49. 2, what is the war since 1980 with the most civilian casualties? Mumble, mumble, mumble. Answer, the war in Congo, Zaire, in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Now, complicated one. Since 1980, what is the war with the most military casualties? No. Military casualties. Yeah, military casualties. Since 1980. Since 19... Iran, Iraq, and the clue is 1980 because that's when it started. 1980 to 1988. We know that the Iranians were sending troops forward in mass frontal attacks, being slaughtered in large numbers. Okay? In other words, the point I'm trying to make is that culturally, what might in some environments be an unacceptable military choice, either tactically, operationally, strategically, or geopolitically, becomes acceptable in another context. Yeah? Anybody disagree? No. And you could see the same thing, as I've said, at the present moment. How President Putin is conducting himself would not be acceptable if you were the leader of Denmark. You know, it just wouldn't be acceptable. Or take crime. Let me give you a good example, because crime is a form of social war. You know? Let me give you a good example. About 20 years ago, I was visiting fellow at the Australian Defence Force Academy. And Sunday morning, I was sitting there reading the Australian, which was the major Australian tabloid newspaper. And a gangster had been shot dead in the Marriott Hotel in Melbourne, you know, one of Australia's biggest cities, that previous week. And they had 2 pages on Melbourne, murder capital of Australia. How many people do you think had been murdered in Melbourne in the previous 25 years? Sorry, the previous 5 years. No, 25. That was it. And that was the murder capital of Australia. Now, if you had 25 people murdered in 5 years in Copenhagen, there would be, or in Zurich, there would be an enormous fuss about it. If you have 25 people murdered in Rio de Janeiro, Johannesburg, Karachi, it's a busy weekend, all right? No, it's true. It's true. In other words, in domestic policing and domestic order, you have exactly the same thing that you have in state-to-state warfare. It is culturally encoded as to how you accept the problem, the tasking for the police, and indeed the reality. I mean, and if you think about it in Italy, you can see this in Italy. When I've been to Palermo 3 times. When I was last in Palermo, the Prime Minister Berlusconi had sent troops onto the streets, and there were armoured personnel carriers with troops carrying guns. Fine, I felt quite safe. I'm not objecting to that. And I found the same thing in Naples when I was there the following year. But the point being that it was a decision on the part of the government. It is not an inevitability as to how to respond. Let's wind that back a second, because we're talking as military historians. Another question for you. There are 6 continents in the world that have permanent human habitation, because Antarctica, there are human stations, but they're not permanent individuals in them. Okay, questions. You put your hand up. I will go through each continent, and the question is, which of these continents has seen the least state-to-state warfare involvement in international warfare, all right? Their countries have been at least involved in international warfare since 1937, when, Japan invaded China. All right, so we've got 6 continents. Number 1, Asia. Number 2, Australasia. Number 3, Europe. Number 4, Africa. Number 5, North America. Number 6, South America. Well, you 2 voted for South America. What's the answer?
North America.
You voted for North America. What's your answer? Okay, well, the answer is not North America. North America, both the Americans and the Canadians have been involved in lots of international wars. You know, the Canadians were involved in World War II and Korea. The Americans have been involved in loads of wars. No, involved in international wars. Which is the continent that's been least involved in international wars since 1937? No! Australasia, the Australians and the New Zealanders were in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. South America is the answer. South America. The Brazilians sent troops to Italia in World War II, but nobody else did. They just sat on their hands. Since then, apart from the war over the Malvinas with Britain, there has been no international war in South America. Not at all. The last international war in South America is the Gran Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay between 1932 and 1935. Now, you will know, as military historians, that the fact that there has not been an international war does not mean that there has not been military history, because the military history of South America has been intense. The military have seized control in many states, particularly Brazil, Argentina and Chile, but also other states, Paraguay, for example. The military has been involved as the arm of the state against regional disaffection, against criminal gangs, in social policing, and also in some cases the state has been the arm of the military. So in other words, to look at, and this is one of my views, is a great intellectual problem for all of us. All of us are interested in battle, siege, the conventional things. I'm fascinated by them. But we also have to integrate into our military history and into the question of strategic choice, into the question of military culture, into the question of geopolitical perspective. We have to integrate into them the domestic tasks on the military as well as the international ones. Any scholar of the ancient world will understand that. Any scholar, quite frankly, you've got here an enormous fortress. What were the prime purposes of those fortresses? The prime purposes were as displays of power, but the power was displayed against the people living here and nearby as much as against other princes. Okay? So one of our great problems is to understand, and I have no answer, but we have to think about how to integrate the domestic control and the way that force is used to that end, force involving deterrent, force involving killing people, force involving whatever. And force has its own strategy, geopolitics, operational needs and tactics if it is involved in the control of a state as much as if it is campaigning elsewhere. And we have to think about how to discuss that and how to build that into the equation. Now, I want one or two comments and then we must go into a conversation, because this isn't a lecture by me. We are all colleagues. We are all having a conversation. So just one or two last points. The comments that you will make, that the two young men have made to me already, that there isn't a sufficient focus on military history in the modern academy, is true. Modern universities do not devote enough attention to military history, even though it is an absolutely crucial way in which power is organised and society develops. And the great sociologists of the 18th century, the secular sociologists, whether an Italian like Vico or whether British like Robertson and Adam Smith, understood that in stadial theories of the development of society, you know, that force was a key element. They understood that you move from primitive society where all males had to be willing to fight, you moved to societies where war was much more a specialised activity. That was their notion of sociological development. So the notion, the idea that you could have written, I mean, in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, there is an account of the history of war. The idea that you could have written about economics or sociology, political science, without understanding war would have been regarded as ridiculous. Same in the Italy of the Renaissance, with Guicciardini or Machiavelli. The idea that you could have written without war would have struck ridiculous. At the present moment, we are in that situation. That creates an enormous problem for us in the academy. Now, in one respect, we are helped. Public interest in our subject is greater than in any other type of history apart from genealogy. Genealogy, who your grandfather is the one that people are obsessed with. But once you move away from genealogy, the type of history that people are most interested in is military history. That is true of television, that is true of magazine articles, and that is something that we as historians need to try and reach out to. We must not only talk to each other. That is important. There is a public out there for us. Second of all, we are helped by technology. Something like this provides a fantastic amount of information, opinion, debate, and it is available free online. And that, again, is really important, because if we find that it is very difficult to use some of the standard techniques, we must be nimble in thinking about how we should move forward and reach bigger audiences. Because the audience... Oh, sorry. Well, the audiences are there for us. Lastly, we should set an example to the other branches of intellectual life. And our example should be a simple one. There is no one way to do it. Our subject is one of continual discussion and debate. We have the fascination of looking at different periods, at looking at different methodologies, at looking at different types of fighting. Siege, petite guerre, Grand Campagne. There is all of the sorts of different things, and then also the questions of counterinsurgency, social control. There are all sorts of ways of looking at and thinking at military history, and we ought to show that we are actually better than those branches of the academic life in which there is an orthodoxy, and what a surprise, it is the orthodoxy of whoever is speaking to you. So what I am urging us all is to accept that we all have differing paths, to listen to each other, to move forward, to try and take advantage of the new technologies, as Virgilio has done, to try and reach across between national historiographies, to use positions in the established universities, as Professor Brizzi has done in a very distinguished university, and you have also done in a very distinguished university, and to try and use those to encourage another generation of postgraduates, but also to know it is not just formal academics and formal postgraduates who will take the subject forward. It is everybody who is interested in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A lot of questions about your lecture. I think Professor Brizzi maybe had some consideration about the lot of problem.
Io parlo dei miei problemi, naturalmente. Cosa faccio? Un discorso io?
Sì. Mi sembra che il professore abbia toccato talmente tanti di quei temi, anche metodologici.
D'accordo, io parlerò naturalmente del mio mondo, e parlerò di un mondo che è un mondo profondamente diverso, ma è un mondo profondamente diverso con regole analoghe. Cioè esiste ad un certo punto, avevo in mente di fare un discorso sul controllo del Mediterraneo, ci arriverò, questo era il discorso che mi proponevo di fare. Però vorrei partire da un'altra considerazione. Noi crediamo che l'Occidente sia una realtà di oggi, non è una realtà di oggi. Non è una realtà di oggi, e una certa riforma all'interno del mondo occidentale ha costituito forse la radice prima e più antica, ed è quella rivoluzione che porta ad un certo punto, che nasce nelle acque tiepide dell'Egeo sostanzialmente, nasce nelle acque tiepide dell'Egeo e porta alla rivoluzione del pensiero razionale d'Occidente. Il pensiero razionale d'Occidente mette poi al centro, e qui arrivo a parlare di quell'altro discorso che volevo fare, il Mediterraneo.
Can I say something on that? I think that's really interesting, this notion of the West and the notion of the East.
Sì.
I think this is really interesting because it takes us to the idea of the mental geopolitics.
Sì.
So for, you know, this idea that you have as to where
Certo.
is the edge of, whether it's Romanitas, whether it's Christendom, whether it's Europe, whatever we mean by Europe. I think that's really
Io credo che ci sia qualcosa prima di tutto questo. Prima di tutto questo c'è la reazione al pensiero teologico, al pensiero teocentrico, al pensiero monarchico del grande Oriente, di quel grande Oriente. Ho completamente cambiato il discorso da fare, di quel grande Oriente che ha un certo tipo di punto di partenza. Poi non so quanto posso parlare, parlo un attimo, vediamo. Di quel grande Oriente che ha tutta una certa serie di strutture, perché ha delle astrazioni che cambiano nel momento in cui noi puntualizziamo la nascita del pensiero razionale nel mondo greco. Ed è un mondo che già guarda al mare. Ecco il discorso del Mediterraneo. Dove si salda il discorso del Mediterraneo? Il discorso del Mediterraneo che prima è Egeo, perché senti che robe. Mamma mia. Sì. E dicevo, c'è un momento in cui il pensiero razionale si realizza in Grecia, e però cresce da un'altra parte. Quasi subito la percezione del mare. Le regioni dell'Egeo sono le regioni importanti. Le regioni della Ionia Egea sono molto più legate alla Grecia propria, cioè sostanzialmente ad Atene e a Sparta, di quanto non sia legata alla Grecia di Settentrione, quella che poi diventerà la Grecia di Settentrione, la Grecia oltre le Termopili. Non è un caso che ci sia questo aspetto. Il mare, la concezione del mare, la proiezione del mare, e quasi subito la percezione che il mondo sia il mare. Sì, c'è l'Asia, ma l'Asia è un'altra cosa. L'Asia è una galassia remota. È una galassia remota che non basta neanche conquistarla, perché quando Alessandro la conquista non ha praticamente nessuna influenza sul Mediterraneo. Il Mediterraneo rimane una orbis, rimane un cerchio, ma è un cerchio che è tale nel momento greco della storia. Periplus, la navigazione circolare, la navigazione attorno, sono tutti peripli. L'esplorazione del Mediterraneo sono una serie di peripli. Il periplo di Eracle, per esempio, quell'Eracle che poi è un Eracle orientale che segue la costa sud dell'Africa, entra in Spagna, attraversa le Alpi e scende in Italia. Ma l'orbis e il potere sul mare, l'orbis e la concezione di Platone: siamo tutti come rane attorno ad uno stagno. Siamo tutti come rane attorno ad uno stagno, e questo mondo neanche quando viene smisuratamente ampliato da Alessandro, ma l'ampliamento di Alessandro è forse l'uomo più grande della storia, però fino a che punto ha contato? Cioè il mondo greco all'interno dell'Oriente è costituito da una serie di isole prigioniere all'interno delle città fondate da Alessandro stesso, da Alessandria ad Alessandria Escate, Antiochia, eccetera, e sono dei piccoli nuclei con una classe dirigente all'interno di un oceano sostanzialmente indifferente. Il vero Occidente si sviluppa appunto ad Occidente. E si sviluppa senza che vi sia una vera talassocrazia. Cioè i greci contano, Tucidide ne conta 13. Tucidide ne conta 13 dalla prima, che è quella di Minosse, fino alle ultime. Diodoro ne conta addirittura 17, ma nessuna controlla l'intero mondo. Perché? Perché c'è bisogno di un'altra rivoluzione, e quello che vince è ancora una volta il pensiero occidentale, ma filtrato attraverso Roma. Cioè nel momento in cui l'elemento fondante del mondo di allora non è più il polites. Il termine non è polis, il termine è civitas. Il termine è civitas e, come dice Benveniste, che è un grande lessicografo, è un grande studioso delle lingue, civitas il civis è piuttosto il concittadino che non il cittadino. La polis è la ptolis, polis o ptolis è l'acropolis, cioè è il centro puntuale. La civitas è l'insieme di tutta la realtà. Ecco, io credo che questa sia la realtà che ha permesso la nascita della sola. Ci sono due realtà che producono l'unica vera talassocrazia sul Mediterraneo, che lo controlla tutto, che è Roma. È l'unica, non ce n'è mai stata un'altra. Questo per due motivi. Uno, tutto il mondo era lì. Nelle epoche successive, anche quando il mondo sostanzialmente è ancora rannicchiato attorno al Mediterraneo, i poteri sono differenziati e non c'è nessun potere che li conglobi tutti. Quando poi si arriva in Atlantico, dopo le regole sono completamente diverse. Come arriva Roma a controllare questa realtà? Le talassocrazie che si ricavano dei peripli loro propri, anche dopo. L'Adriatico sarà il mare di Venezia, per intenderci. Addirittura sfida il potere spagnolo, sfida il potere turco, eccetera. Hanno chiamato, cito un delizioso libro di Perez Reverte, Corsari di Levante, quella puttana subdola e orgogliosa, parla di Venezia, dice che ha osato definire l'Adriatico il mare, il golfo di Venezia. Ecco, Cartagine fa la stessa cosa. Ecco, dov'è che Cartagine perde il controllo? La struttura cartaginese è apparentemente perfetta, però è un mondo che è il Mediterraneo. Si dice ci sono tanti Mediterranei, lo ha detto anche Franco Cardini. Beh, vabbè, sì, d'accordo, ci sono tanti Mediterranei, ma l'unico Mediterraneo vero è il nostro, perché ha delle dimensioni che sono percepibili, che sono in un certo senso controllabili. non ha i grandi accessi che ci sono fuori rispetto al mondo esterno negli altri Mediterranei. Qual è la realtà? La realtà è proprio la civitas, non è la super tecnologia marittima che hanno i cartaginesi prima che ce l'abbiano i romani. La realtà è la capacità di assorbire prima le aristocrazie locali, gli Etruschi, i Latini, i Campani, siedono molto presto, siedono nel Senato di Roma, e controllano le singole, uso il termine greco, le singole poleis, controllano Tuscolo, controllano Lanuvio, controllano Lavinio, controllano Capua, controllano Tarquinia, controllano e governano il tutto da un centro, facendo di tutte queste realtà una forza che non ha i numeri dell'impero di Alessandro Magno, ma una coscienza che i sudditi di Alessandro Magno e degli imperi ellenistici non avranno mai, che rimarrà limitato al mondo greco e alle cleruchie greche in Oriente. Questa è la realtà che sopraffa Cartagine. Cartagine sceglie nella seconda guerra, ci si chiede di solito perché nella seconda guerra punica Cartagine scelga una guerra terrestre, perché una guerra navale non la vincerà mai. Nella guerra terrestre può sperare nel genio di un generale fra i più grandi della storia. Cioè il cartaginese con un occhio solo è uno dei generali più grandi della storia. Io su questo e di questo sono veramente convinto. Non può vincere una guerra navale perché? Perché a Roma il problema non è la tecnologia. A Roma la tecnologia l'ha mutuata copiando modelli cartaginesi, c'è quel vecchio racconto, ma soprattutto l'ha mutuata traendola da modelli greci con cui è in simbiosi, e la tecnologia l'ha pareggiata e addirittura l'ha superata, ma il problema non è la tecnologia, il problema sono le ciurme. Cioè le ciurme, mentre gli eserciti cartaginesi di terra sono eserciti mercenari, le ciurme sono ciurme cittadine. La prima guerra punica, che è una guerra essenzialmente per mare, costa, secondo le cifre che vengono proposte, 700 navi da guerra ai romani e 600 ai cartaginesi. Quasi certamente la cifra è esagerata, ma anche che noi la riduciamo a metà vuol dire tra le 80 e le 100.000 vittime, le 100.000 perdite per entrambe le potenze. E queste perdite Roma le può sopportare, Cartagine no. Perché Roma ha i soci navales, ha la civitas sine suffragio, per cui gli eserciti vengono da strutture diverse. Ecco, Roma sceglierà a un certo momento, a un certo punto ci sarà un confronto tra l'ultima grande talassocrazia, che è la talassocrazia punica, e che è il modello, una talassocrazia punica che ha, diciamo così, al servizio di quello che è stato definito un imperialismo riluttante. Imperialismo riluttante è una frase di Sabatino Moscati, cioè un imperialismo che ricorda un po' certi fenomeni moderni, cioè ricorda un po' la frase detta da certi presidenti americani: vai, combatti finché conviene e vieni via. Questa sembra essere la logica di Cartagine. Roma a un certo punto è un imperialismo difensivo dettato dalla paura e una talassocrazia riluttante, cui Roma rinuncia sistematicamente perché la ritiene più costosa, e Roma il suo dominio sul mare lo conquista principalmente via terra. Le flotte trasportano degli eserciti, non combattono per mare, combattono per mare in alcune circostanze, poi in certi momenti le flotte ricompaiono. Adesso io ho detto una cosa molto rapida, andrebbe vista molto di più. Il controllo cartaginese è mirabile da certi punti di vista, perché la costa sud, Cartagine, Utica, le fosse fenicie, è la Spagna, Gades, Cadice, Cartago Nova e tutta la zona fino poco a sud delle acque territoriali di Marsiglia, cioè tutta la Sardegna. E poi naturalmente i punti di controllo sullo stretto di Sicilia, che sono i punti, la costa occidentale della Spagna, i promontori occidentali della Spagna e ovviamente Cartagine stessa e le altre città fenicio-puniche alleate della medesima che sorvegliano lo stretto di Sicilia, ma non è mai indiscussa. Viene messa in discussione da Siracusa, è stata messa in discussione in un primo tempo da Marsiglia e alla fine, quando sopravviene la potenza romana, Cartagine ne perde il controllo. Roma, al contrario, non avrà mai, vi dicevo, è una talassocrazia riluttante. All'indomani della seconda guerra punica, Roma non intrattiene una flotta. Roma non ha una flotta vera e propria, ce l'ha, ma è quanto basta. Roma distrugge le flotte altrui, distrugge la flotta di Cartagine, distrugge la flotta della Macedonia, distrugge la flotta della Siria, del regno di Siria. E quando Cartagine mostra la volontà di praticare un riarmo navale, distrugge Cartagine. Cioè all'inizio è un imperialismo difensivo, se vogliamo chiamarlo così. Ecco, quindi la politica di Roma nel Mediterraneo è proprio di vederlo sostanzialmente nel suo insieme in proiezione ultima. Tanto che Roma, quando noi parliamo di urbi e torbi, non parliamo del concetto pontificio, parliamo dell'urbs e dell'orbis, che è appunto il circuito dello stagno delle rane che Roma controlla nel 31 a.C. con Augusto. Ecco, sono due politiche completamente diverse, anche perché è diverso il mondo al cui interno questo tipo di logica, questo tipo di discorso si sviluppa. Basta, ho già parlato anche troppo.
Io vorrei tornare un attimo al concetto di Occidente, la frontiera storica a cui tu facevi riferimento fra l'Occidente e l'Oriente è quella tra Europa e Asia, cioè i Dardanelli, no? Sostanzialmente.
Diciamo
l'Egeo, sì, perché è quella...
Anche se è l'Egeo fino a un certo punto, perché tutto sommato le colonie greche al di là dell'Egeo, cioè gli ateniesi, piangono Mileto distrutta con la famosa Iliu-Persis, la famosa tragedia che ricorda la distruzione di Ilio, ma in sostanza fa venire in mente agli ateniesi la distruzione di Mileto. Piangono più per la distruzione di Mileto che per la conquista della Grecia settentrionale.
Sì, ecco, però noi poi abbiamo un concetto moderno di Occidente. Quindi salto la questione, diciamo, dello spostamento della Nea Rome, no? A Costantinopoli, eccetera. Ma nel concetto moderno di Occidente, quando è che comincia, a mio avviso, una politicizzazione nuova del concetto di Occidente? In riferimento alla storia italiana, che è una storia dal punto di vista geopolitico segnata dagli Appennini, che dividono un'Italia tirrenica da un'Italia adriatica.
Più ancora, gli Appennini che a un certo momento sono addirittura una dimensione a sé, perché il concetto appianeo Italia tirrenica da Italia adriatica, ma poi a un certo momento c'è anche proprio il concetto del mondo delle quindi l'Appennino è una dimensione vitale.
Sì, ma tuttora i collegamenti tra una parte e l'altra dell'Italia sono più difficili dei collegamenti che ciascuna di queste parti ha col resto del mondo. Ebbene, questo a mio avviso avviene nel momento in cui si forma una realtà nuova rispetto alla storia recente, e cioè l'alleanza tra i due grandi rivali della storia moderna, e cioè la Francia e l'Inghilterra. Alleanza che avviene contro un nemico particolare, che è essenzialmente la Russia. E la nostra storia nazionale è molto connessa con questa vicenda, perché in realtà è attraverso la partecipazione del Piemonte alla guerra di Crimea che si pone una questione geopolitica e non più, diciamo, etico-politica dell'unità italiana. La prima guerra di indipendenza italiana, che è una guerra etico-politica, viene disastrosamente perduta dai sostenitori dell'unità italiana. La seconda, che avviene solo 10 anni dopo, 1859-1861, invece viene vinta perché si crea un consenso geopolitico internazionale sulla utilità che l'Italia si unifichi. In relazione certamente al problema dell'apertura del canale di Suez, che avverrà 10 anni dopo, ma in prospettiva comincia allora, no? Il problema del braccio di ferro tra due alleati in qualche modo, quindi tra la Francia e l'Inghilterra, ma in realtà avviene in qualche modo attraverso la creazione di un soggetto politico egemonico nuovo, che è, a mio avviso, incentrato su una alleanza disuguale in cui c'è una prevalenza britannica e un brilliant second francese per l'espansione coloniale europea, sostanzialmente verso l'estremo oriente, quindi diciamo attraverso la linea proprio del Medio Oceano, quello che l'Imes chiama il Medio Oceano, cioè il Mediterraneo più il Mar Rosso e l'accesso all'Oceano Indiano.
Tu sai che l'Imes è un'idea mia.
Certo, è il nome, certo, sì. E quindi diciamo io vedo un primo Occidente che si basa anche su tutta una serie di valori, quindi diciamo l'espansione dei valori a quell'epoca cristiani, ma anche diciamo di superiorità della razza bianca, quindi cristiani e anche razziali, e per la civilizzazione dei popoli barbarici dell'Oriente, oltre che dell'Africa. Ecco, questo è in un certo senso il primo Occidente che determina un cambiamento nel ruolo storico dell'Italia.
No, se parli per l'Italia senz'altro, se parli del primo Occidente allora sai, secondo me c'è Tordesillas, se permetti.
Beh, certamente anche questo.
C'è Tordesillas,
sì.
cioè le due Tordesillas e la scoperta di Magellano dall'altra parte, quando dice io sono tornato fuori da un certo tipo di livello, quando tu hai la prima idea della sfericità del globo. Io però parlo di un principio, quello che ho invocato io, è il principio della cultura razionale che precede tutto questo, ti hai capito? Cioè,
Sì.
E addirittura tu hai i due occidenti che resistono ai due orienti nel discorso greco delle due battaglie di Maratona,
sì.
di Salamina,
sì, però
e di
c'è un fatto nuovo ed è la spaccatura dell'Europa tra Europa occidentale e Europa orientale.
No, secondo me c'era già un pochino prima.
Comunque sono tutti temi, diciamo, su cui io penso potremmo interrogare il punto di vista del professor Black, perché anche se diciamo oggi non ci ha parlato del punto di vista britannico generale, ci ha spiegato che ci sono vari punti di vista nella storia, no, della geopolitica britannica, però sicuramente l'input principale di questo cambiamento è britannico ed è anche interno alla visione britannica, perché c'è, a mio avviso, una tensione molto forte tra la componente liberale, che è poi rappresentata da Palmerston in questa epoca, e la componente invece più diciamo legata all'esperienza delle guerre napoleoniche. Lo stesso Wellington, no, che è ancora attivo negli anni 30 e 40 del 1800. Quindi ecco, vorrei chiedere al professore se può, je voudrais vous poser une question sur l'importance du changement des alliances qui s'est produit entre la France et l'Angleterre au sujet de la question d'Orient et au sujet de la question de Suez.
Right, okay. I've been asked the question as to what do I think was the significance of the change in Anglo-French relations for the geopolitics in the Mediterranean in the 19th and 20th centuries. Well, it's certainly true. Britain and France haven't actually fought a war between the two powers since 1815. There have, of course, been tensions and difficulties, as in the Fashoda crisis in 1898, and you could argue that the conflict with Vichy France between 1940 and 1942, which involved fighting in Lebanon, involved fighting in Syria, involved British naval action against the Vichy fleet at Mers el-Kabir in 1940, you could argue that that was one of the last of the Anglo-French, or the last of the Anglo-French wars, and certainly one of the last of the significant big wars in the Med, not just World War II, but the conflict between Britain and Vichy France. What I would say is that you're absolutely right that there was nothing fixed about the present. So for the British, I've just been making notes about this. What does the Mediterranean mean? Does the Mediterranean stop at going westwards at the Straits of Gibraltar, or does it include not just Gibraltar but Tangier, which the British had as a base in the late 17th century, or Cadiz, which the British used in various times as a naval base, or even Lisbon? Going eastwards, does, for the British, there was power projection through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus into the Black Sea. From the 1800s, when the British failed, they sent a fleet into the Dardanelles and they were beaten off by the Turks. But then later, with the support of the Turks, they sent a fleet and an expeditionary force into the Black Sea to fight the Russians. In 1854-6, they sent fleets to the Bosphorus or the Dardanelles, with or without the Turks. In 1878, with Turkish support, in 1915, the Turks beat them at the Dardanelles. In 1920-23, the British were in occupation of both the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, and immediately after World War I. So, in other words, where does, as you were saying, where does the Mediterranean end? And then, how far does this link, this geographical thing, which Braudel talked about so well in his language on his book on the Mediterranean, how far does that link with alliances? Because after all, the British could only get into the Black Sea with really the Turkish support and actually the French. There were Italians there. The Piedmontese played a major role in the Crimean War. Then again, the British and the Italians and the French and everybody else were there in after World War I in the Russian Civil War. You know, there were British troops and French troops in the Crimea. There were, the whole thing. So where exactly does the Mediterranean stop, and how far for any one power
Does it depend upon alliances? So how far is the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean really a Roman-Egyptian cooperation with Egyptian grain and Egypt being part of the Roman system in the 1st century, just as the British could only be in India with Indian cooperation? I mean, there was no way the British could have operated in India without a lot of Indians cooperating with them. And again, so therefore, just as we know this from work that people have done on the Habsburgs in Italy, that the Habsburgs are able to act as an Italian power because Italians cooperate with them. All right? Italians play a major role in the Habsburg armies in northern Italy. There are aristocratic families that cooperate. There are mercantile elites in places like Milan that cooperate with the Austrians. That is why you have Austrian Italy. Once that cooperation collapses, Austrian Italy collapses. It's not just on the battlefield. It is a political process as well that ends Austrian Italy.
Thank you very much. Vladimir, do you think to add some consideration about
First of all, I would like to agree with Professor Black about the importance of the personal and social parts of the military history, because you know that during maybe until 1990s, military history was accepted first of all as history of military actions. A lot of people discussed military uniform, tactic, organization of the military, and so on. But then more important questions rose. First of all, and it is my favorite question, is how military influence the governments. Because if we take the military revolution, the subject, the topic all of us likes, in what way, in what personal way, in what governmental way the military revolution happened? Because nothing is automatic in history. In history, history is made by the historical figures. And when I started to research on military history of Eastern Europe, for example, I found very interesting phenomenon that one of the most active periods of the military revolution, the second half of the 16th century, is featured by the direct influence, direct invasion of the military figures in the general government. For example, if we take one of the prominent figures of the Ottoman history, Grand Vizier Özdemir Aglu Osman Pasha, who was military, and who started the period of military revolts in the Ottoman government, which became a pattern how the Ottoman policy developed during the 17th and 18th century. He was Egyptian Mamluk, military man by his origin, and he came to power by the military turnover in Istanbul, for which he brought from his Iranian war the first Ottoman, not social army, not army of the palace slave like Janissaries, but the army of mercenaries, army of hirings. If we take the similar development, for example, in Poland, we know that at the end of the 16th century, the most important figures of the Polish history in this period, like Zamoyski, were born in nowadays Western Ukraine. So they represented the the colonization movement of the Polish nobility, who obtained new properties and new perspective for their social aggrandizement in the nowadays Western Ukraine, which became a field of the Polish colonization at the time. The same situation happened in Russian history, in the Muscovite history, where the people who made the government of first Muscovite Tsar Ivan the Terrible, they represented some military factions. They were not representatives of the old aristocracy, which ruled over Muscovy since the time of Mongolian invasion, but they represented the new military class, which was created by the military reforms produced by grandfather of Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Great. So there are some periods in the human history when the military leaders or the representatives of the military classes directly come into the government. And for me, if we make some parallels, because we don't have some scientific discussion, but exchange of opinions, for me it is very important what kind of social groups, of social military groups, the groups. What is social military groups? Social military groups, it is absolutely new category of thinking on the military history, which may change our understanding of military history. Because if we make some parallel with Marxian approach, Engels, who authored a lot of articles on military history, he once told that during the rearmament of the West European military, with the military revolution, with the gunpowder revolution, the new social classes come to power. Social class is not only the social group which has some special position to property, some special position to finances, to government, but it is the social group which has special position to the military activity. It corresponds with Professor Black's accent on the question who owns the strategy, because strategy has its owners. Strategy is not the abstract thinking as, for example, Luttwak tells, but it is a property, intellectual property of some special political factions and social military groups which try with some special way of thinking to generate the military approach for their social aggrandizement, for their rise in power. So, social military groups are the special social groups which have the particular position to military. Early modern urban population of Western Europe is one of these social military groups. And we know how entering of the common population into the military changed West European military during the military revolution. The same situation happened, for example, maybe very famous example of the action of the social military group is the beginning of Ukraine, because Ukraine was created by the Cossacks, and the Cossacks are the social military groups of the colonizing peasants who owned the firearms to fight nomadic Crimean Tatars who raided the territory of the nowadays Ukraine and really blocked any economic development of this territory until the Cossacks opposed them with the firearms. So it is another example of the social military groups. And every social military group, as all the human special groups with special interest, it produce the leaders. And the question, if we address the nowadays history, is what are the social military groups which are behind the latest military moves in the world? For example, the military move of Putin in Ukraine, the military move of Israelis in Gaza, and other military moves of the United States. Because the United States, while it is not involved in the international conflict nowadays directly, nevertheless, it participates in most of the active military conflicts in the world now. The question is, what are the social military groups which are behind the governments now, and what are their interests? Because if we answer on this question, we could understand what is their strategy, and we could forecast what is the way of our world. And it is directly the situation how military history could support the thinking of politicians, the thinking of political analysts today, because the military history could produce the pattern of thinking on understanding the situation. If we understand the interest of the social military groups which back the modern military active governments, we would understand the strategy of the governments, we would understand their next step, and we would understand, we would answer, including our personal questions, how we have to, what kind of behavior we have to develop in the world around us, and we could answer the big political questions. And if we analyze the topic of the nowadays discussion, the root topic of nowadays discussion, one of the main question is why some regions of the world has the imminent expansionist agenda. And Mediterranean is one of the region which is basically expansionist in history, not only in modern history or early modern history. Expansionist powers, they appeared in the Mediterranean history one after another. Rome after Greece, Byzantium after Roman Empire, and so on, and Ottoman Empire after Byzantium. Why Mediterranean region is so expansionist, aggressive in its strategical stance to our world? It is very interesting question on which the historians must to answer. And another question that I have to, which is relevant to discussion today.
We must try.
No. It is another very question on which I want to have an answer. It is.
Vladimir, I think we need. Come on. I think we need to bring this to a close and move towards a more general discussion. Okay. Okay.
No, it is question to you.
Yeah, no,
and to
but
your colleagues.
I would like to have everybody be able to take part.
Okay.
So you've asked your questions. Now let us hear from the others as well. Okay. Okay. So briefly, if people have bullet points, please, that they would like to offer. No, it's okay.
Sorry for being too verbal.
No. Bullet points. Yes. Quickly. Yes.
Yeah. Few questions. First one, coming from the discussion. First of all, thank you for.
No. Come on.
the link between geopolitics and human geography.
Right.
Something you assert in your paper. I think.
Okay, let's take that. Let's go one at a time.
Okay.
Otherwise, we just the link between geopolitics and human geography is a very good question, because usually when people talk about geopolitics, they put the emphasis on physical geography. In other words, distance, closeness, physical geographical factors, mountain ranges, supply of oil, this sort of thing. There is, on the other hand, the fact that you can have a similar physical geography, but very different human geographies. North and South Korea have very similar physical geographies, but that doesn't mean that there is a determinism that they should have the same human geography. So I agree with you. If we are looking at geopolitics in terms of human geography, it is inherently much more varied.
Yeah.
Next, quick.
Second question. We talked about a perspective, a British perspective, but do you think that it does exist a grand strategy? So can we establish a longue durée as you presented?
All right, great. It's a vocabulary. The vocabulary of the subject of strategy is not one that is fixed, okay? And there are considerable national variations. So the term grand strategy is particularly popular with Americans. It is less popular with Brits. It doesn't mean the Brits are right, doesn't mean the Americans are wrong. There are different vocabularies. So that's the point. One that is useful is an American term, which is strategic geography. The idea that there might well be a long-term strategic interest that comes from a geographical relationship. Now, in essence, I don't agree with him. In essence, that is what President Putin is saying when he lays claim to the legacy of Peter the Great. I personally think it's wrong, and I agree with Vladimir. There are military strategic groups here, military political groups. I think that's exactly right. But the idea that there is a very long-term strategic understanding in a particular country is a strategic version of the German concept of a Sonderweg. You know what I mean by a Sonderweg? A Sonderweg, a unique path. And the German concept is that each country, but particularly Germany, what a surprise, has a unique path to modernity and a unique path to their particular interests. The problem with that, and here I think Vladimir is right and I'm right as well, is that the idea of a Sonderweg is owned by particular groups, and those particular groups have their own political, cultural, economic, social reason to own that interpretation. You don't drink the water in a certain place and say, because I drink the water in Italy, I am going to think this strategically, but because I drink the water in Britain, I'm going to think that. It doesn't work like that. It has to be constructed. Right, next question. No, you've had two. Next question.
So I had only a small observation for Professor Brizzi, so should I
ask him.
Or English?
Yeah, no, ask him. Go on. Yeah, absolutely fine.
No, io mi stavo solo chiedendo all'interno della sua esposizione relativa all'Occidente centrato sul Mediterraneo, quale ritiene sia in quel contesto il ruolo della civiltà romana orientale o bizantina, che è quella di cui io mi occupo, che è un po' un unicum da quel punto di vista, dato che appunto ama molto della monarchia orientale, come lei citava prima.
C'è tutto il concetto del potere, io l'ho trattato in imperio, cioè che cosa succede, qual è la struttura fondamentale, cioè si dice l'impero bizantino, chiamiamolo impero bizantino, chiamiamolo impero romano d'Oriente, sono romaioi, sì, ma nella realtà è una cultura con profonde matrici orientali. Il dibattito è cominciato molto tempo prima ed è cominciato rispetto ad un Occidente che ha il tema del, diciamo così, ha una base aristocratica, persino a livello imperiale. cioè la scelta del migliore. A un certo punto si tenta di imporre la scelta del migliore. Il problema sono le aristocrazie romane che a un certo punto producono, lo dicono i saggi orientali, anche se sono saggi greci, ma sono già personalità che sono immerse in una temperie culturale diversa. Per esempio Filone Giudeo o Strabone dicono il potere imperiale è il popolo, sopprimete le aristocrazie. Tutta un'altra tradizione invece si trova a urtarsi con il concetto della successione, cioè come facciamo allora a far succedere qualcuno? Attraverso un regime dinastico o attraverso la scelta del migliore? Cioè continuiamo a tenere in vita un principio aristocratico attraverso la scelta del migliore o passiamo direttamente al concetto orientale che è tipicamente dinastico? Ecco, l'impero d'Oriente sopravvive proprio perché le sue strutture sono più, diciamo così, preparate al cambio che viene poi imposto dai culti orientali in Occidente e direi soprattutto dal cristianesimo. Anzi, se vogliamo andare a cercare un modello per tutto quel tipo di tradizione lì, lo troviamo in San Paolo. Il San Paolo che nella lettera ai Romani, San Paolo ha capito tutto e lo ha capito molto prima di tutti gli altri. Addirittura Flavio Giuseppe ha capito il problema ebraico dopo che questo problema si è manifestato. Paolo lo capisce prima, perché Paolo sottrae la costola del cristianesimo rendendola, diciamo così, esportabile, vorrei usare questo termine, però il modello è quello che è già il modello di Augusto, cioè un nuovo patto con gli dèi, un imperatore su tutti gli altri e, diciamo così, la subordinazione delle aristocrazie, che alla fine sarà l'eliminazione delle aristocrazie. Però c'è un fatto, che se noi vogliamo una struttura sovranazionale, le aristocrazie ci vogliono. Se noi sopprimiamo le aristocrazie, in Occidente arriveremo alla divisione catesne, popolo per popolo, mentre prima non è così, cioè io vengo da Ispalis, da Siviglia, o vengo da Cartagine, o vengo da Londinium, vengo da tutte le parti del mondo romano, arrivo a Roma e conservo i legami con le terre di provenienza, di cui, non so, io sono il patrono di Siviglia, di Ispalis, sono il patrono di Londra, di Londinium, sono il patrono di Cartagine e naturalmente questo rapporto esiste. Se io in nome di un concetto diverso di successione al trono e di un concetto diverso di potere accetto la logica orientale, queste aristocrazie muoiono e soprattutto muore un altro concetto, muore il concetto di civis, cioè il concetto di cittadino, dopodiché io ho il suddito. San Paolo porta tutto questo, omnis potestas ad Deo, pasa exousia apotut seu, cioè è un genio che imposta una svolta che è una svolta totale e il mondo bizantino sopravvive grazie a questo, è una civiltà altissima, ma non è già più la prima Roma, è la seconda Roma. Non so, spero di avere le risposte.
Sì, sì, grazie.
Yep, next. We've had you, Vladimir. Lorenzo.
I'm just worried you brought the English weather to Ferrara, my friend.
Yeah, I think Julius Caesar's legions would have felt exactly the same.
Oh.
Well, actually, interestingly enough, that's one of the reasons why it was good to use auxiliary units from Frisia and other such places like that on Hadrian's Wall, because these people were used to the horrible weather. Yeah. But question, seriously, on strategy, anything you'd like to ask?
I think it was a great lecture.
Oh, well, no, I don't think... Right, you two, gentlemen in the back row. Yes, you.
I have a question.
Good.
I'm interested in your point of view about the initial hostility of Great Britain about the construction of Suez Canal.
Right, I've been asked about the initial hostility of the British about the construction of the Suez Canal. Well, first of all, as you know, there was rivalry with the French. There's no doubt about that. That was important. And in particular, concern about the French role in Egypt had been a factor in British political discussion going even before 1798. You can see it in the 1780s. The British were worried about what the French intentions were in Egypt. But there's a separate issue. There's a recent good book on this by the Cambridge scholar John Parry, and what he looks at is the development of British interest in Iraq in the 1830s, 40s and 50s. And that was linked both to religious proselytization, but also to the idea that the British should build a railway from the eastern Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Another route essentially before the Berlin to Baghdad railway of the Germans. And within the British, one of the things Parry shows is that within British discussion, there was a tension between those British figures and commentators who wanted the route to India to be via Syria, Iraq, down river steamers down the Tigris and the Euphrates, so partly a river route, and then through the Persian Gulf. And those people instead who wanted Egypt and the Red Sea. And that debate really went on until the Suez Canal became part, because then it's the Iraq policy ceased to be viable in British eyes, and it became necessary to think about preempting the French in Egypt.
Thanks.
No, pleasure. My friend.
Yes, but I have not an actual ask, but just a reflection, because I may speak about the period of my interest, the 17th century.
Yeah.
And I found very interesting the first notice of the English fleet in the Mediterranean during the first English-Dutch war.
Correct.
And English and Dutch fought a battle in front of Livorno.
Correct, 1653.
During the first
Yeah.
Dutch war.
Yeah.
Then I ask if you think the entrance of English fleet in the Mediterranean was to compete and challenge the Dutch presence, or English were really interested to develop the trade in the Mediterranean, diminishing the Venetian.
Yeah. The English had been, very good question, very good. The English had become more interested in Mediterranean trade during the reign of Elizabeth I, from 1558 to 1603. And they had looked to Italian powers that seemed uneasy with the Spanish Habsburgs, all right? And the two powers they were most interested in were Venice. The English saw the Venetians as allies for a long time against Spain, and the other one was Tuscany. And Livorno was developed, the English phrase for a mercantile base was a factory. You know, today we think of a factory as a manufacturing thing. Originally, the word factory, and English is like every other language, Italian is the same. Words change their meaning. So originally, a factory was after the word a factor, who was a commercial agent, like, you know, you would know, or our friend over there, Lorenzo, would know. So the English developed a factory at Livorno. In Livorno, the Medici followed a policy in which both Protestants and Jews were allowed to have a more liberal situation than elsewhere in Tuscany. This was very, very valuable for the English. Now, until 1585, England was in competition with Spain, but wasn't at war with Spain. What that meant is that it was possible to trade peacefully in the Mediterranean, though you needed significant. English merchantmen in the Mediterranean always had a lot of cannon and a large crew to be able to work the cannon, not so much because of the Spaniards at first, but because of the Barbary pirates, all right? The English send fleets into the Mediterranean before 1653. They send squadrons into the Mediterranean in the early 17th century against the Barbary pirates to try and demand that English slaves be released. So, for example, there's a big expedition, an unsuccessful expedition in the 1620s against Algiers, which the English send. By that stage, the English textile industry is desperately looking for Italian and Mediterranean markets. In particular, what they have done is they have developed what they call the new draperies. The new draperies are lighter woolen textiles. The traditional English textiles were heavy textiles, heavy woolen textiles designed for the markets in Britain, the Low Countries, Germany and Northern Europe. They developed lighter ones. In fact, the city I live in, Exeter, was a major centre in the production of these cloths, and these are sold. The biggest foreign market, the biggest single foreign market, is the factory at Livorno. So the British have, as it were, an annual big shipping there. They also have an average annual big shipping to Smyrna. It's known as the Smyrna, the Eastland the company with which, the company that trades to the Ottoman Empire, the biggest British entrepot is not Constantinople, it's Smyrna. And through that, the British, again, they sell textiles, they sell all sorts of things, anything that they can sell. They sell metallurgy, they sell cannon, they sell all sorts of things. And they bring back they bring back a certain amount of bullion. They bring back also spices, they bring back silks, they bring back ceramics, they bring back cotton. So the British have to defend these convoys as they go through the Mediterranean. So yes, there's competition with the Dutch, there's competition with the Barbary pirates, there's uneasy relations at times of peace with both the French and the Spaniards. Obviously, there's big problems at times of war. And there is the attempt to develop commercial markets in Italy, because Italy is very rich, and Italy is also able to pay in bullion. And you've got to remember this, because it has accumulated bullion, not because it's mining it, but because it has accumulated bullion. And you've got to remember this, that you're in a metallic currency system in Europe. So in other words, today, if you are balancing a trade, you will balance it with financial instruments, usually transmitted digitally, but if necessary, if you're a drug baron, you'll do it with banknotes, all right? But in the 18th century or the 17th century or the 16th century, you have to do that through metal means. And there's a real problem here, because the accumulated metal stock of Europe is not large enough for the trade demands on it, particularly because those trade demands are further squeezed by the demands for conspicuous cultural consumption, all this gold leaf and all the rest of the stuff. Now, the biggest external source of bullion is the Spanish world. Okay? The Spanish world, through the New World, has created this situation that you are getting bullion coming into Europe, principally silver, a little bit of gold, but the gold doesn't really come in till the Portuguese gold discoveries in Brazil in the 18th century. So it's silver in the 16th and 17th century. This silver comes to the Spanish world, but the Spanish world includes Naples, Messina, both of which the British trade with. It includes Livorno, because although Livorno isn't Spanish, there is actually Spanish silver circulating throughout Italy. And one of the reasons to trade here is because they have got an ability to give you things that you want. The British also are financing their trade with the Ottoman Empire, with Russia for naval stores, and with the East India Company. They're all negative trades. So the British have to have bullion to ship to these places. So you need to make a profit on your Italy trade to help you in the Mediterranean trade at a loss in the Ottoman Empire. And the ability to move, you know, financial instruments, in other words, promises to play bullion, which is what you're generally talking about, is absolutely crucial in that respect. And if you want, I'll shut up in a second, but if you want a good example of that in the play, think about William Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice, where the Christian merchant, not Shylock, the Christian merchant, Antonio, is shown on the Rialto in Venice. He has 4 ships out, 4 carracks, and he has the problem suddenly that all of his 4 ships appear to have failed, in other words, to have been lost, either sunk or captured. Now, what that is doing is that is destabilizing his entire fiscal network, because ordinarily you would actually reconcile your different trades, rather like a modern financier would reconcile their trades at the end of the day on the money markets.
Yeah, precisely. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jeremy. But in your opinion, what is the role of the little island for the economic warfare against a continental power?
A little island what, like Britain or like Sicily?
No, not only Sicily, but Capri.
Oh, Capri,
Lisa.
right. I've been asked what was the role of the Mediterranean islands in the economic conflict between continental powers and offshore powers like Britain. Well, I think that's a very good question. In order to trade, you needed to have access to a protected market. Now, classically, since really the age of free trade treaties really come in the 1840s and 50s. The first major Anglo-French free trade treaty is the Cobden Treaty, is 1860. And now, I mean, I'm sorry we're not, but essentially the European Union is an enormous free trade area, okay? So and since you had the GATT agreements after World War II, there's been more free trade on the world system at the present moment. In historical terms, that's very unusual. In historical terms, what is much more common is protectionist systems in which other powers have tried to gain access, either by force or by subterfuge or both, or by recruiting support within the political alliance, which is true of most imperial systems. So most imperial systems, whatever their political structure, are actually alliances between constituent groups. As you were arguing on the military side, the same thing is true on the economic side. Okay? So, what you therefore have to do is work out how to get your stuff into this system. So what you're looking for generally is usually it's high value goods which have low bulk, which are easiest to move in. So if you go any night, I've done this, if you go any night at the Straits of Gibraltar and you put on some binoculars, you can see very fast ships, boats going from Morocco to Gibraltar. What are they transporting? They're not transporting illegal immigrants. They're transporting a much more valuable product. Anybody? Illegal cigarettes. And the Spaniards try and stop it because, as far as they're concerned, Gibraltar is a route for smuggling into Spain. Okay? Now, just as, I mean, there's no doubt about it, the Spaniards are right. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Now, all of these islands, and you can Gibraltar isn't an island, but it's in effect an island. It's all of these bases were sources through which major powers would try and move things into other power systems. So in the Baltic, For example, the island of Bornholm was an example of this. In the North Sea, the island of Heligoland was an example of this. And the British held on to Heligoland till I think it's 1890, and when they swapped it for Zanzibar, of all stupid things. So what you've got is this kind of economic activity is much more common. In my view, and I was discussing it with Lorenzo yesterday, I think that the political, social and economic cement in most states is becoming much weaker. And when you have the cement becoming weaker, then you will get a greater number of groups who will find it advantageous to trade illegally. I mean, you take my country, the Customs and Excise estimates that a third of the cigarettes sold in Britain are not paying duty. In other words, they've been smuggled in. I think you would probably find that the situation is not too. I would very much doubt in the Balkans that even that the percentage is as small as a third. So you have a lot of goods. I mean, the drug trade is famous because it's illegal, but what we're talking about is also true of a lot of legal stuff is being smuggled quite actively. And people don't tend to think of smuggling anymore. You know, they just think it doesn't happen. They think it happens with people trafficking, but they don't think it happens elsewhere. But this sort of activity is getting more common. Again, if you look at the Caribbean, you have several of the islands are failed states, you could say. The British Virgin Islands, high level of corruption. You get lots of stuff moved illegally through this. Or even, if you want to take a very interesting example, in Guadeloupe and Martinique, they're both part of metropolitan France. If you look at how the police are done there, the junior police, the very junior ones are local people. The officers all come from metropolitan France. The officers are generally only allowed to be there for about 6 months and then are recycled because there's so much problem with corruption. And I'll tell you a funny thing. I was giving a lecture to a group of very wealthy people on a cruise there earlier this year. And I said to them, you know, we'd been to both Martinique and Guadeloupe, and I said to them, for what you bought, was anybody ever offered a receipt? And the answer, of course, was no, because the whole thing is a cash economy. It is so different to metropolitan France, it's not true.
Fascinating.
But islands are always centres of illegality. Always. Islands are centres, and they are also places where you get people of different ethnic groups, different religions. So you want a famous example of that, and there's been a good book on this recently, the island of Curacao, off the coast of Venezuela. Curacao, Dutch island, founded in 1643, settled in 1643. Dutch Protestants and Dutch Jews, all of them hated the Spaniards. But what did they spend their time doing? They actually spent their time smuggling into Venezuela. Illegal. Naughty, naughty. But Venezuela needed these smugglers because the provincial government, you know, which was Spanish, it needed, and the major product coming out of Venezuela in the 17th and 18th century is cacao. The only major market is Europe. They needed this stuff to go to Curacao and to be shipped up to Europe. Now, legally, they shouldn't have been sending any of it to Curacao. It should have been moved somehow to Veracruz. How are they going to do that? Which was the basis of the flotta, which was the shipment went every year, the official shipment of goods from the Spanish Caribbean to Seville. But there's no, you're not going to do that. You're going to sell it to these Jews and Protestants who you can't stand. And the whole thing is very, very funny. And that went on all the way through the Spanish Empire. You get people like Carlos III issuing enlightenment decrees about modernising provincial government. Smuggling goes on. Nobody gives a damn about the decrees coming down from Madrid.
Penso che abbiamo messo veramente a fuoco una quantità enorme di temi e di problemi. Penso che il nostro prossimo volume in Naval History sarà ricchissimo, perché dovrà mettere insieme gli aspetti strategici, commerciali, e economici e militari. E effettivamente credo che potremmo rimanere qui un'altra settimana fino all'esaurimento fisico. Purtroppo penso che i nostri ospiti ci pongano dei limiti a cui ci stiamo avvicinando, perché sono circa 2 ore, no? che stiamo... Sì, restano ancora qualche minuto.
Yes. I will be staying here to take some and do you know I organised the rain so that nobody could go and that you all had to answer and stay here and discuss this. Thank you very much for coming along. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lorenzo, tu non hai avuto notizie da Campochiari?
No,
non ti ha chiamato ancora, perché il problema doveva essere il problema ora per te oltre interview by Campochiari, Parabello, but we don't receive this. Maybe in the next day Campochiari will connect you.
Yeah, but I go back to England tomorrow. Yeah.
Bene, allora penso che siamo liberi adesso di stare anche un po' qui insieme, insomma, ecco. Sì, prego.
No, penso che siamo...
Volevo chiedere, scusa Paolo, volevo chiederti se vuoi mostrare al professore.
You're going on for too long. You must learn to talk more quickly.
E questi non sono per...
No, perché tanto prende la sta rivolta,
Sicuro? Ma sono...
No,
ti ringrazio.
Anche io non mi ricordo.
No, quello mi sa che è solo... infatti adesso porto il
Seminario ha preso la valigia mia, ma è leggerissima, poi ha preso la sacca. Questa è quella col marmo, 6 kg, questa è un'altra cosa.
No, basta, una...
Fa una cosa, vendila,
La porto